Now we're on Daf Memches Amid Beis. Kid Rabbi Zara, as Rabbi Zara said, that by doing this overdose of leavening, you contributed something positive to enhance this mixture because now it's Re'uya Lachameh Bo Isus Acheros Tashma Miseifa. If we learn the Sefer this brisa, you'll see that there's no way that we can use Rabbi Zera's logic here. Because in the Sefer, it says, Hayayin shenofal l'soch adoshim, so wine fell onto lentils, and the wine itself is yayin nesech. V'chometz, and vinegar, which is also yayin nesech. Shenofal toch grisim, and grisim, as we said before, are beans that have crevices, and now the iser, the liquid, seeps in between these cracks and crevices, is also. The tarovis is also. This is the Tanakama, and this is Rabbi Meir's Shita. Again, there's no leavening here at all, so there's no, Rabbi Zera's Lechame Ba Isacheres is not going to apply here. Rabbi Shimon Matir. V'hachanami de Pagam Ikara. Right, what happened in the Sefer is that when the wine falls on top of the lentils or the vinegar falls on top of these split beans, it's immediately pogame the tam. This is detrimental to the taste of the lentils and the taste of the beans. Upligi. And yet the Tanakama says it's osur, even though from the moment it fell, Meikara, when the Tarovis was created, it was already an Osin Tam Lifgam situation. V'chi tema hachanami. Kiddushani le ula l'Rabbi Chaga sheshbiach l'besof pogam. Maybe you'll tell me the old answer of Chaga. That Rabbi Chaga says that we're talking about a case where first it was cold and then he heated it up. And if it was cold at the beginning, then in fact the wine or the vinegar could enhance the taste of the lentils or the beans. And therefore that would mean that according to Tanakama, when he says it's also, it's because at stage one, it was mashbiach, and later on he heated it up, and then it became tam pogum. So the Gemara says, "Umi pligik ishbiach v'sof pagam v'ktoni." We're going to prove from the brisa that if at first stage, because the beans were cold or the lentils were cold, there was a positive impact, then everybody would agree, even Reb Shimon, that it's also because once the tam l'shvach seeps in, and it was also, you can't be mafkia that isur, you can't remove that isur. Ktani, because it says nafal shel truma tchila divrei hakol asa. If the truma fell first onto the dough, then everybody agrees, even Reb Shimon, that it's prohibited, it's asur, because in this case the dough is prohibited because the prohibited leaven, which means the nafal shel truma, initially enhanced the dough, only afterwards it became impaired. So we can't say that this last case of the brisa is referring to a case where first they were cold beans and then he heated it up. Because if that be the case, then even Rabbi Shimon, as we see here in the Sefer, would be oser because it was mitchilaso shvach elav shmamin of pagam mikar machlokes. Therefore, we have to conclude that the machlokes here between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim only applies in a case where it was pogam immediately when it entered into the mixture, into the taroves, and therefore we establish Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of Rabbi Meir, that Rabbi Meir is oser, he prohibits even in a case of pogam meikar, shmamina, and that seems to be the final conclusion and a solid proof that we have a Tanaic source in the Brisa that Rabbi Meir holds no Saint Tam lifgam meikara os. Now the Gemara goes on a little bit of a tangent here. the Brisa had quoted 3 different cases of mixtures. And the question is, why do we need all 3? What's the chiddush in each one of the 3 that we wouldn't have known from the other 2? Hani tlos above, these 3 paragraphs, the Ketani, that are written in the Brisa, Lamali, why do I need all 3? Bishleim, I understand, Bava the Sefer, Kamashma Poge Meikar Machlokes. Right, the last case is going to teach us that the whole Machlokes is when it was Poge Meikar, because that's the proof that we had to support Rabbi Yochanan in Rabbi Meir. Mitziasa Nami, I could justify the section in the middle of this brisa where truma that was si'ar fell in and into the dough, and at that point it was already shvach, and therefore it's a shpiach ulebesof pogam divrei kolos. That even Rabbi Shimon is modeh that since at stage 1 it was mashpiach, therefore it remains us. Ella Reisha Lamali, but I don't understand the first case where the Brisa records that the 2 CRs, the Sa'ar Shel Truma and the Sa'ar Shel Chulin, fell bevas achas together into the dough. And in that case, there's no chiddush whatsoever. Why? Hashtu mas seifa de lo kamashbia klal asri rabbanon. If the Tanakama, meaning Reb Meir, prohibits it in the case where there was no shvach at all, it was pure pagam, then what would the Brisa be telling me? Reisha de kabash biach mi boy, I need the Reisha to tell me that Rabbi Meir would answer it if at stage 1 it was l'shvat. No chiddush whatsoever. Omar Abaye. Abaye says, Reisha Reb Shimon Itzrich. The Reisha is coming to tell you that Reb Shimon is modeh in the case where it was mashbiach meikaro. V'hachi karmalei rabbanon Reb Shimon. The Tanakama, meaning Rabbi Meir, turns to Reb Shimon and he says the following: Isa zura uya lahachmitz b'shtei shos mi garam leishetachmitz b'shah achas isur. What happens over here when there are 2 CRs that fell onto the Isa simultaneously? There was CR of Truma and CR of Chulin. And Truma, of course, is also Zara. And isn't there a logical, powerful reason to say that it's awesome? And even Reb Shimon should have to say it's awesome. Why? Because what happens is, how long would it take for the fermentation to take place, for the leavening to take place? Well, if you only had the Si'ar Shel Chulin, then it would take 2 hours. But now that you added the Si'ar Shel Truma to add another power to the process of Si'ar, now it only took 1 hour until it leavened. Is therefore Isur, everybody should agree that the Si'ar Shel Truma that fell together with the Si'ar Shel Chulin should aser it. Rabbi Shimon. So what do we do, Taka, with Rabbi Shimon? How does he counter against this argument? And that's going to be the chiddush of the Reisha, to say that Rabbi Shimon for deswegen holds its mutter, even though it sped up the process of leavening. It, when I say it, I mean the Si'ar Shel Truma. Kishbichu shneim hishbichu, kshepigmu shneim pigmu. Now, if we translate this line in the Gemara literally, it's saying about the 2 CRs that enhanced the dough to cause leavening. Both of them enhanced it. And when, the 2 leavens were overdosing the leavening process, these 2 CRs, then again, both of them are doing that together. So in other words, what Reb Shimon is saying the following: I'm going to be modeh that this taroves was first enhanced, and then it was impaired. And why was it impaired? Because he added Sior Shel Truma. However, that only makes sense, said Reb Shimon, if the Sior Shel Truma fell in by itself, on its own. And then certainly it was mashbiach the dough. And therefore it's awesome. And even Reb Shimon concedes that it's awesome. But here in the present case where we're talking about a simultaneous process by which both the Sior Shel Truma and the Sior Shel Chulin fell in together, then it was a concerted partnership effort where two agents of leavening worked together, as I said before, in concert. Now, if they're both operating together in concert, then there's an overdose of leavening. You didn't need both the Sior Shel Truma and the Sior Shel Chulin. One would have sufficed. And now you doubled it up, and immediately it's pogame the tarovis, the dough, the isa. And therefore, a moda here that in this case it would be also. Frag to Gemara, Rabbi Shimon, litzrich heter ve'isur b'hari adodi ve'litzar. So now we have to understand, if simultaneously we see them working in concert, then we should really come to the conclusion that the dough is also. And the Gemara answers, Reb Shimon l'tamei di'amar afilu isa ve'isa nami lo mitztarfe d'tznan ha'orla v'kalei ker mitztarfe, and Reb Shimon omer ein mitztarfe. Pile plum. This is a radical chiddush of Reb Shimon l'kula, and to my knowledge, nobody paskins like this kula. That Reb Shimon holds that every isur has its own shame, its own category, and its own identity, and it operates independent of any other isur. We cannot combine the two in concert. Okay, now we have a very strange sugya, because if I would ask you the following question: if a mouse falls into some liquid, there's a famous story about a cholent in a certain big yeshiva where a mouse jumped into the cholent. Anyway, but that should be no saying tam livgam. I mean, would anybody want to eat a mouse or the taste of a mouse? Now this mouse fell into a barrel of beer. Asrei Ra lahi shikra. Rav says that the beer is awesome because it took over the time of a sheretz, namely of an achbar, and the Torah prohibits 8 shrotzim. Amru Rabbana Kami the Rav Sheshes Nemo Kasavar no say Tamlif Gam Asur. Did Rav ascribe to that shita, which we identified as Rabbi Meir's shita, against the Chachamim, that no saying Tamlif Gam is Asur? And here it's a case of Poge Meikara. Why would it be awesome? What about Nevela Aruya Leger? So it is possible, theoretically, that Rav accepted the shita of Meir, but the Gemara wants to avoid that, and Rav Sheshes is going to say the following. Oh, Rav Sheshes. The Alma, as a general rule, Sava Rav no sin tam lifgam muta, like the Chachamim of Rabbi Meir. B'hacha, okay, now we get to a whole philosophical Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that if the Torah had to prohibit something, then we wouldn't have known that it was prohibited. And if, says Reb Meir, you flip it around and the Torah was matir something that I would have intuitively been matir, then once again, we have to ask the question, why? Now, let's take a case, says Rabbi Shimon, where logically something should have been also. I'm sorry. Logically, something should have been mutter, and the Torah says it's also. In that case, Rabbi Shimon says, I'm sorry, I kept saying Rabbi Shimon. I apologize. I meant Rav. Rav says that if the Torah prohibited something which intuitively we would say is mutter, then the Torah goes all the way. And it prohibits it even beyond. And that's going to be the case of a sheretz like a mouse. Hachachidishu. I never would have prohibited a mouse. No one's going to eat a mouse. It's intuitively repulsive. Don mimis mayis ubedilim inchi. No one's going to eat a mouse. Why did the Torah have to bother with wasting its breath to prohibit something which is so repulsive that you and I would never have eaten it? So the Torah must be telling me that above and beyond your natural repulsion from eating it, there's an additional isur. Hilchot no sing lif tam lif gam nami os. Meaning, according to Rav, it was, so to speak, osir even before the Torah prohibited it, in a natural, intuitive sense of repulsion, being repulsed by. If on top of that isur, the Torah had to go ahead and prohibit eating a sheretz, it must be teaching me that despite the fact that the sheretz has a terrible taste, it's no saint tam lifgam, nevertheless it's awesome. Brilliant thesis of Rav Shimon, of Rav Sheshes in interpreting Rav. And the Gemara rejects it. If we go with your logic, with your principles, Rav Sheshes, then litame lach v'yavish. In the laws of Tumah V'Tara, and we're going to now study a little bit from a Mishnah in Masechta Nida. And the Mishnah in Masechta Nida tells me about a sheretz, and also nevela and shichvas Zara, that a sheretz is only mitame when it just recently died and it's still moist. But if you leave it for a certain amount of time and it dries up, then it's not mitame. That's called eina mitame yaveshin. That doesn't make any sense according to Rav Shimon, according to Rav Shesh's interpretation of Rav. Why? Because according to Rav Sheshes, in the case of a sheretz, we are naturally repulsed by a sheretz. So if the Torah nevertheless had to tell me, stay away from a sheretz, it's going to be metame you, it must be telling me a new chiddush to the extreme, and it's metame even when it's yavish. So the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, according to your kasha and your objection against Rav Sheshes, why not take it a step further? Utamech shichva zera to tame lach v'yavish. Alom the Mishnah Nida says that metame lachin v'ein metame yaveshin. That shichva zera, after it dries up, it's not metame. Now, shichva zera is also something that's naturally repulsive, and according to Rav Shesh's logic, when the Torah says it's metame and stay away from it, the Torah is going a step further and telling me even if it's yavish. We have to come back to square one and say that according to Rav Sheshes, there's a separate gzeras hakosuv to be mitaher yavish. Shichva zera omer achmona b'ru'uyel azriya. When the Torah speaks about shichva zera being metame, it's only something that's ru'uyel azriya, and that's why it says in the pasuk zera, shichva zera. And when is it ru'uya lazria? When can it impregnate a woman? Only when it's wet and not when it's all dried up. And therefore, the Torah is telling me that it's not Matami Yovich. But logically, if not for the pasuk of Shifas Zara, with the emphasis on the word Zara, Ru'il Azriya, we would have said, according to Rav Shimon, that what? That it's, according to Rav, I'm sorry, I keep saying Rav Shimon. According to Rav, it's Matame, even Yovesh. And once we have that pasuk with regard to Shifas Zara, we have a parallel pasuk with regard to Shrotzim. What does it say in the Parsha of Shrotzim? Hachinami, the pasuk says, B'mosam, when they die, they're metame. Ke'ein mosam, meaning they have to be in the same state that they are when they die. The shrotzim, when they die, they're moist. They haven't dried up yet. And then they're metame. So again, we have a special xeris hakosiv to be mafkia tuma, to be metayr tuma, in a case of yavesh, according to Rav Sheshet. Rav Shimi minarda lo kasha. I'm sorry. Maski floor of Shimi Minarda. I don't know if Shimi is short for Shimon, I don't know. Anyway, Umi Mois, the whole premise of everything that we've been saying in Rav Sheshes is that a mouse is repulsive. Follow Ol Al Shulchan Malachim. Wow. The kings love to put mice, dead mice on the table, and apparently they eat the mice. The two types of mice. Could write a whole children's book here. There's the mice of the fields, and there's the mice of the cities. You don't want to eat the mice of the cities. But the mice out in the fields are very beautiful mice, and they were ol al shulchan malach. Omar Rava, hilchas anosein tam lifgam mutui paskin, like the chachamim and Rab Shimon who rejected Rabbi Meir, and nosin tam lifgam is mutter. And therefore, I have to figure out what Rav meant when he said that if a mouse falls into beer, it's asur. It's akbar b'shichrali adanamai time of the Rav. Should we say that according to Rav Mishum Dekasov and Nosin Tam Lefgam Asur, Rav Paskins like Rabbi Meir, then Nosin Tam Lefgam is also, therefore when the mouse falls into the beer, it asses the beer. However, less hilchus kavase, nobody paskins that nosin tam lifgam is also, and therefore we have to reject Rav. But we can go with another approach. But when a mouse falls into beer, it enhances the taste of beer. So, we have to put out a new company, Carlsberg and all these different kinds of beer. Now we have mice beer. And we'll finish up with this Iboilahu here on Daf Samach Tes Amud Aleph. Nafal lego chalaman. What is the law in a case where a mouse falls into vinegar? Shall we say that since vinegar has such a sharp taste, then any kind of beneficial flavor that the mouse would add to the beer, in the case of beer, it cannot add to the vinegar because the taste of the mouse is lost, is completely detonated, if you will, by the sharp taste of the vinegar. And therefore it's mutter. Amalei Rav Hillel Rav Ashi Havi Uvda Bekan. Rabbi, you know the story that they tell about Reb Chaim Kanevsky that he was learning in Masechta Taurus about a chagav, a certain kind of a grasshopper, and he didn't know what it looked like. He was curious, and immediately a grasshopper landed on the top of his shelf where he was learning. I have a feeling that the same thing happened to Rav Kahana, right? Rav Kahana was asked this question: what happens if a mouse falls into vinegar? And guess what happened? Avi Udebe Rav Kahana. I mean, what are the chances that a mouse would fall into vinegar? I don't know, but that's what happened. So Rav Kahana now sees the reality, and he has to determine whether or not the taste of the mouse is felt in the vinegar, and it enhances the taste of the vinegar. The Asar of Kahana, and he prohibited it. I don't know. Maybe he gave the vinegar to a kfela, and the kfela tasted it and said, "Wow, there's a taste of a mouse in here. It really tastes good. This is the mouse beer that I always wanted to buy." However, the Gemara rejects it. And with this, we'll conclude for today. Amalei, so Rav Ashi says, Rav Hillel, hahu imartuti imitart. What happened is that when the mouse fell into the vinegar, somehow the chemical power of the vinegar caused the mouse to dismember, and it became, pieces and pieces. And therefore, Rav Kahana prohibited it because he was afraid that if somebody drinks the beer, he might actually drink a piece of the mouse. So again, the final conclusion of the Gemara is that a mouse does not impart any taste to enhance the vinegar. It's lost. The taste is not discernible in the vinegar. But the reason why Rav Kahana prohibited it is because he was afraid that somebody who would drink the vinegar might swallow a piece of a mouse. Now, in Shrotzim, as far as being Matami is concerned, then the shear is Ke'adasha, as long as it's the size of a lentil, which is pretty small. And Rav Kahana assumes that a lentil-sized piece of a sheretz, not only does it transmit tumah, but it's prohibited for achila, and you get malchus. And he was afraid that a very small piece of the mouse would be imbibed by the person who drinks the beer. Okay, then. So this is where we'll stop for today.